Imagine for a second that you are sitting across from someone, maybe a friend or, I don't know, perhaps a therapist, and they ask you a really simple everyday question like, how do you feel? And suddenly your mind just goes entirely blank.
Right, just totally empty.
Yeah. Or, put yourself in another scenario. You're standing in a room, you feel your heart racing, your stomach is just tied up in knots, your palms are sweating, but you have absolutely no idea if you're terrified, if you're thrilled, or if you're like simply coming down with the flu.
Which is such a disorienting experience.
And it really is. And if you're listening to this right now, you probably take it for granted that when your heart races, you immediately know why. But what if that internal translation system was constantly offline? Like, what if that sensory confusion was just your baseline?
It's a profound disconnect. It really is.
Hmm.
I mean, you are experiencing the physical reality of an emotion in your body, but the cognitive label for it, the actual word, remains entirely out of reach.
And that biological disconnect is the core of our deep dive today. We are pulling from this incredibly detailed article by ASD, and our mission is to decode a phenomenon called alexithymia.
Right, alexithymia.
Yeah, which is essentially an emotional static that affects up to half of all autistic people. So we are going to untangle this trait from the core features of autism, explore the structural impact it has on daily life and mental health, and outline some really unconventional strategies for translating your body's hidden signals.
It's going to be a lot of ground to cover.
It is, yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. The article defines alexithymia, coming from the Greek, as a lack of words for emotions.
Yeah.
But it emphasizes repeatedly that this is a personality trait, right? Not a psychiatric condition, and certainly not an absence of feeling.
Exactly, and that distinction is paramount. The feelings are undeniably present.
Yep.
I mean, the physiological arousal is actively happening in the nervous system. The struggle is entirely in the translation process. Taking those internal bodily sensations and converting them into verbalized, understandable concepts. The emotion is basically felt as static.
Mm-hmm.
And to really grasp why this translation fails on a mechanical level, we have to look at interoception.
Interoception. So we are all familiar with the outward-facing senses, right? Like sight, sound, touch.
Sure.
But interoception is the internal sensory network. It's how your brain perceives the state of your internal organs. Like it lets you know you are hungry, thirsty, or that your muscles are tense.
It's your body's internal dashboard, essentially.
Yeah, the dashboard. So if emotions are inextricably tied to these physical sensations, like happiness feeling like a lightness in the chest or fear presenting as a rapid heart rate, it stands to reason that a breakdown in interoception directly causes alexithymia, right? Because if the brain's internal sensors can't detect the physical shift, it just can't label the emotion.
Precisely. Emotions are essentially energetic, physiological shifts in the body. They aren't just, abstract thoughts floating in the ether.
Right. They're physical.
Very physical. They're physical events happening across your vagus nerve and your heart rate variability down in your gut. If your interoceptive system is struggling to pick up on those shifts, the data literally never reaches the cognitive centers of your brain.
So, is it like trying to watch a movie with the picture on, but the audio completely muted? Like the action on the screen is definitely happening. There are car chases and explosions, which represent the physiological emotion.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, but the soundtrack you need to actually understand the context and the narrative of what's going on is just completely missing. You can see the chaos, but you can't interpret it.
What's fascinating here is that your analogy captures the physiological reality of the situation beautifully. By framing alexithymia through the lens of interoception, it removes the societal stigma of simply not knowing how you feel.
Right, it takes away that shame.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is not a character flaw or some psychological defense mechanism in every case. Often, it is literally just a sensory processing difference.
Yeah.
The raw data is being generated by the body, but the bandwidth to transmit that data to the conscious mind is just restricted.
Wow, that completely reframes the entire concept of emotional intelligence. And, the source brings us to a data point that completely shifts how we need to look at neurodivergence.
The autism connection.
Yes, the connection between this emotional static and autism. Up to 50% of autistic adults experience alexithymia. And in autistic teenagers, one study found it was up to 55%.
The overlap is substantial. I mean, it's huge. And historically, this high rate of co-occurrence has caused a tremendous amount of systemic harm.
How so?
Well, because it led the medical community to misunderstand what autism fundamentally is. And this brings us to a groundbreaking framework called the alexithymia hypothesis.
Right, the Alexithymia hypothesis, which suggests that many of the traits society has long assumed were core features of autism, like struggling to read facial expressions, or missing the emotional tone in someone's voice, or lacking cognitive empathy, are not actually caused by autism at all.
Nope, they aren't.
They are caused by the co-occurring alexithymia.
Correct. For decades, diagnostic manuals and societal stereotypes just blended the two together. But if we separate them, autism is characterized by deep focused interests, a need for routine, sensory processing differences, and a really direct, literal communication style.
Oh, okay.
Alexithymia, on the other hand, is strictly the difficulty in identifying and describing emotions. When researchers actually controlled for alexithymia in their studies, meaning they separated the participants who had both from those who only had autism, they found something incredible.
What was it?
The trouble recognizing facial expressions or vocal tones largely disappeared in the autistic individuals who didn't have alexithymia.
Wow. Wait, so when we look at famous pop culture portrayals of autism-like characters who seem completely robotic and incapable of reading a room, are we actually just looking at severe alexithymia layered on top of autism? Has this completely skewed our cultural stereotype of the spectrum?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how alienating that revelation is for autistic individuals who don't fit that narrow, stereotypical mold. It validates their profound emotional depth. And perhaps the most damaging structural barrier created by this stereotype is the myth that autistic people lack empathy.
Oh man, yeah. Let's dismantle that, because the source material makes a crucial distinction between emotional empathy and cognitive empathy.
It's a vital distinction.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding this correctly, emotional empathy is the visceral experience of feeling another person's pain, right? Autistic people often have incredibly high emotional empathy, almost to the point of becoming physically overwhelmed by the mood of a room.
Oh, absolutely. The feeling is intensely present.
Right. But cognitive empathy is the ability to intellectually understand and articulate what that other person is feeling. So the alexithymia creates a roadblock in the cognitive translation, not the emotional feeling itself.
You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, you might feel a friend's grief so intensely that your own nervous system just goes into overdrive.
Yeah.
But because you lack the emotional vocabulary, because the interoceptive data isn't translating, you cannot articulate that support verbally. So to an outsider who is expecting a standard neurotypical response, you might look detached or indifferent when internally you are completely, totally emotionally flooded.
That creates such a profound barrier for anyone trying to navigate a world that demands continuous verbal validation. Like, if this crucial distinction is so often missed by society, these individuals are carrying an immense, invisible cognitive load every single day.
The daily burden is massive.
Let's look at how this emotional static actively disrupts everyday life, because the signs are everywhere.
Yeah, one of the most common daily adaptations is relying on others to act as an emotional mirror.
An emotional mirror.
Right. Because the internal signals are so unreliable, an individual might rely heavily on a partner or friend to interpret their state. They might unconsciously wait for someone to say, "Hey, you seem really anxious today, you're pacing," before they can actually connect their physical tension to the abstract concept of anxiety.
Oh, wow. So you essentially have to outsource your internal state to the people around you.
Exactly.
And for those listening, just think about how much energy you use just deciding what to say in a difficult conversation. Now imagine expending that same amount of energy just trying to decipher if your own racing heart means you are excited about a promotion or terrified of a confrontation.
Right, because the physical sensations are nearly identical.
Exactly. If you can't read the subtle interoceptive differences, you are essentially flying blind.
And because of this sensory confusion, individuals often attempt to manually mimic the emotions they deduce they are supposed to be feeling in a given context. Yes, masking. You observe the room, calculate the appropriate reaction, and put on the corresponding facial expression. But masking requires a relentless amount of cognitive energy. You are consciously operating a physiological system that in a neurotypical brain just runs automatically in the background.
Man, if masking requires that much active, conscious processing, it makes sense that the brain simply wouldn't have the bandwidth to process the actual genuine emotion in real time.
It really doesn't.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Is that what leads to the delayed processing phenomenon mentioned in the source?
That is the exact mechanism, yes. Delayed processing occurs when you experience an event, but the emotional reality of that event doesn't register in your conscious mind until hours or sometimes even days later.
Days later.
Yeah. You might endure a highly stressful meeting at work, function perfectly, display all the correct masked reactions. Then at 9 o'clock at night, while you're simply brushing your teeth, you break down in tears and have absolutely no idea why.
So it's like your brain is a computer downloading a massive, complicated file in the background while you go about your day. And the notification that the download is complete only pops up on your screen hours later.
Yes. When the system finally has enough free memory to handle it, that is a very accurate way to visualize it. And understanding this lag is vital. It's a powerful coping strategy.
Because society demands instant reactions.
Right. Instant synchronized emotional reactions. But recognizing delayed processing grants you permission to process feelings on your own timeline. You don't have to force an immediate response.
That's so validating. But the biological toll of operating this way, the masking, the delayed processing, the constant sensory confusion, it has to be structurally punishing on the body.
Right, it's
Yeah.
incredibly draining.
Yeah, the Hey ASD article links this heavily to anxiety, depression, and severe isolation. What is actually happening in the nervous system to cause that level of emotional burnout?
Well, think about the physiological loop of an emotion. When a stressor occurs, your sympathetic nervous system activates.
Yeah.
Cortisol spikes, your breathing quickens, your muscles tense up.
Fight or flight.
Exactly. In a neurotypical process, cognitively identifying the emotion, saying, oh, I'm angry about this, helps close the loop. It signals to the brain that the threat has been identified, allowing the parasympathetic nervous system to eventually step in and calm the body down.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah. With alexithymia, you experience the physiological stress without the cognitive release of naming it. The loop never closes.
So the body just stays in a constant state of high alert. The allostatic load keeps building up because the brain never gets the stand-down signal.
Exactly. That chronic physiological stress, sustained day after day, year after year, is what physically degrades the nervous system and leads to profound emotional burnout.
So if the daily toll of this disconnect is so severe, how do people figure out they have it? And where does it actually originate? The source points to a really complex mix of genetics and environment.
It's definitely a mix. Genetically, researchers have found shared vulnerabilities for atypical connectivity in specific brain regions, particularly the insula and the amygdala.
The insula, okay.
Right. The insula is essentially the brain's interoceptive hub. It maps the visceral states of the body. And the amygdala processes the emotional significance of those states.
So if the neural pathways connecting these two regions are atypical,
then the biological bridge between physical sensation and emotional awareness is quite literally under construction, or just closed.
wow. Okay, so that covers the genetic and neurological side. But the article also emphasizes environmental factors. How does something like trauma or a lifetime of masking actually sever that interoceptive connection?
It happens through a mechanism really similar to dissociation.
Really?
Yeah. If a child grows up in an environment where their emotions are constantly invalidated, or if they experience persistent trauma, feeling those intense physical sensations becomes dangerous. It becomes unbearable.
So they just shut it off as a defense mechanism.
Exactly. In response, the brain actively downregulates interoceptive input. It turns down the volume on the body's signals to protect the conscious mind from overwhelming physical distress. Over time, that defense mechanism becomes entrenched. A lifetime of suppressing physical responses can structurally sever your connection to your own inner world.
The brain does whatever it takes to survive the environment it's in.
It really does.
So for someone who recognizes these patterns in themselves, how do they actually get a diagnosis? The article notes that alexithymia isn't in the DSM-5 because it's considered a trait, not a standalone disorder.
Right. It's not a disorder itself.
But it is measured using tools like the Toronto Alexithymia Scale, or the TS20, right? Where a score of 61 or higher indicates high alexithymia.
Yes, the TS20 is the standard clinical tool. It is a self-report questionnaire where individuals rate their agreement with statements about their emotional experiences.
Wait, let's think about the logic of that test for a second.
Right.
You are giving a written questionnaire about feelings to someone whose primary neurological struggle is knowing what they feel. Asking a person who fundamentally struggles to reflect on their emotions to fill out a self-report questionnaire about their emotions, isn't that a massive inherent paradox?
This raises an important question, and it is one of the most substantial barriers for neurodivergent folks seeking support. The paradox of self-reporting in alexithymia is a widely recognized clinical flaw.
I mean, how could it not be?
Right. If you don't know what you don't feel, how can you accurately rate your feelings on a 1 to 5 scale? This is exactly why competent professionals must look beyond simple, standardized numerical scores.
They need a bigger picture.
They do.
Yeah.
They have to prioritize a holistic, lived experience approach. Sometimes, with the individual's consent, clinicians will use observer scales where a partner or family member provides their perspective on the person's emotional expression.
That makes a lot more sense. And even with a comprehensive evaluation, patients still have to navigate clinician bias, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The source points out that many professionals will observe an autistic person struggling with emotional articulation and mistakenly attribute it entirely to their autism, completely missing the alexithymia piece, which means the individual is denied the specific support they actually need.
And that leads to a crucial realization about intervention.
Yeah.
If traditional talk therapy relies heavily on top-down cognitive processing, asking a patient, how does that make you feel? It is demanding a vocabulary these individuals inherently lack.
Right. You're asking them to speak a language they don't know.
Exactly. It forces them into a neurotypical framework, which often leads to the therapy stalling entirely or even causing further trauma.
So knowing the challenges of diagnosis and the heavy daily toll, how can individuals actually cope? We need to shift from the problem to some highly actionable, neuro-affirming solutions.
And there's some really great ones.
Yeah, the goal here isn't to fix oneself, but to work with a unique emotional style. The Hey ASD article outlines some fascinating strategies, starting with a body-to-emotion map. How does that bypass the cognitive block we just talked about?
It works by utilizing bottom-up processing. Since emotions register as physical sensations first, the individual learns to become an objective observer of their own physiology.
Like a scientist studying themselves.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
You track your physical sensations and the context in which they happen without trying to force an immediate emotional label on it.
So you're building a literal database, like tight stomach plus pacing around the living room before a meeting equals anxiety.
Yes.
Or a clenched jaw plus feeling physically hot after someone interrupts you equals anger.
Precisely. Over time, you begin to recognize the bodily pattern. You don't need to access the abstract emotional word right away. You just rely on the empirical data your body is giving you. It practically improves your interoceptive awareness over time.
That is so smart. And for those who find verbal processing entirely exhausting, the article suggests utilizing visual and symbolic support.
Visuals are huge.
Yeah, like using emotion wheels to simply point to a feeling. But they also suggest assigning colors to moods. The source mentions using specific clothing, like wearing a certain color autism hoodie or a piece of jewelry to silently communicate your state.
This strategy is highly effective because it completely bypasses the brain's speech centers, which can become paralyzed during emotional overwhelm.
Right, the words just aren't there.
Exactly. So if a partner or a roommate knows that a blue hoodie means you are overstimulated and require silence, the communication happens seamlessly without a single word being spoken. It drastically reduces that allostatic load we discussed earlier.
I love that. Another strategy involves using curated music playlists for specific moods.
Yes, music is a fantastic tool.
You can use a specific playlist to match and process the feeling for you, again, bypassing the need for words. And finally, there's a strategy that seems totally transformative for relationships. Communicating needs via physical sensations rather than emotional labels.
This completely changes interpersonal dynamics. It really does.
How so?
Well, instead of trying to force yourself to say, I am feeling emotionally neglected and stressed by this interaction, which might be completely impossible to articulate in real time,
Yeah.
you state the physical reality.
Yeah.
You say, my chest is tight, my breathing is shallow, and I need to step away for a moment.
Because it's factual.
It is undeniably accurate to your physiological experience, and it gives your loved ones clear, actionable information on how to accommodate you without getting bogged down in abstract emotional debates.
So instead of trying to force yourself to read a book in a language you don't speak, you're essentially acting as your own translator. You're creating a customized personal dictionary using bodily sensations, colors, and actions.
That is a brilliant synthesis.
Yeah.
It is ultimately a journey of deep self-acceptance. You are validating that your emotional language is real. It is simply structured differently. The objective is never to conform to an arbitrary societal standard. The goal is to build connection and regulate your nervous system on your own terms.
Building connection on your own terms. That is the perfect through line for everything we've covered today.
It really is.
Let's briefly recap the massive value we've extracted for you, the listener, from today's sources. We have separated the core traits of autism from the emotional static of alexithymia.
Huge distinction.
Huge. We've explored the physical roots of this disconnect, how atypical connectivity or the muted interoceptive system leaves the brain without the data it needs to close the physiological loop, leading to masking, delayed processing, and burnout.
Right.
And we've walked through actionable neuroaffirming ways to map your body's hidden signals to create a deeply personal emotional vocabulary.
It requires us to completely reframe our understanding of what emotional depth actually looks like.
It absolutely does. And before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to ponder. We have talked so much today about the struggle to find the right words for feelings.
We have.
But if our society relies so heavily on rapid-fire verbal articulation to validate that someone cares or feels, what other profound unspoken emotional languages are we completely missing in our daily interactions with the people around us?
That's a powerful question.
Think about that the next time you or someone you love is standing there with a racing heart and a knot in their stomach, searching for a word that just isn't there. The feeling is real, even if the word is missing. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Stay curious, stay empathetic, and we'll see you next time.